a great privilege to be here. Thank you to Malcolm, and thank you, all of you, for coming today. I really appreciate it. Very grateful.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the election, and I think all of us have been. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, how does this compare with other elections? I think a lot of my conservative friends are saying, why are the liberals so upset about this? And I try to think of and explain that this really does feel different, especially to people in San Francisco. So how is this different, and what is this showing us about our character and our situation as Americans today?
Well, terrific question with no simple answers, of course, but I think it is different. I think we're in uncharted territory, and I think the research is supporting some of that. So, for example, when Malcolm mentioned this study by the American Psychological Association that was released just in February, the American Psychological Association has been doing this study for quite a number of years. This is the highest level of stress experienced by the populace in the dozen years or so the APA has been doing this, and that includes the 2008 recession year. And so we are in unprecedented territory. There is something different about this time, and there's a confluence of factors, we think. Part of it is the person who ended up winning, of course, Donald Trump, but also it is about...
So in other words, like he doesn't have political experience, or so he's a different kind of candidate.
Right, sure. Certainly a very different kind of person in that role. And we also have this issue of, you alluded to the 24/7 news that we're all experiencing, the CNN, the talking heads, and so forth, and everything caught on tape. And certainly people may have criticized other elected officials, including Obama when he was elected. A lot, people from the right were not happy about that, of course, and people were not happy about the second George Bush election, particularly given that he won 5-4 with the Supreme Court intervention and so forth. And people were very upset about that, but not at this kind of level. So there does seem to be something unprecedented about this moment in time, and that creates a tremendous amount of upset, discombobulation, and what we are sort of talking about, sort of informally. Obviously, this isn't a diagnosis that's come out of the psychiatric Bible, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, DSM-5, or the ICD-10. No, we're calling it post-election stress disorder. And we may laugh a little bit about that, but if you talk to people, people say, yeah, I've got that.
How has it changed from January through now? I mean, are people kind of settling into the new regime as kind of like the new normal? Or?
Well, that's a terrific question. It's really hard to know because the data isn't really quite out. It takes a while to get, empirical research data out, and the American Psychological Association's research that was based on surveys back in not only 2016, tail end of 2016, but also the early part of 2017. And so we'll have to wait for another cycle to go by to see what that particular survey will say. Of course, there's other research that's starting to unfold and emerge, but it takes a while for that stuff to go out. But if you talk to people on the streets, and of course we're here in California, we're in San Francisco, this is a faith community, and so forth. We have a certain window into the world that may be different than other windows into the world. But certainly, and my colleagues, psychologists and other mental health professionals who I talk to around the country and have been talking about this quite seriously when we get together and so forth. And even some of my psychologist colleagues from Canada are talking about this. Even our Canadian friends seem to be a little discombobulated by all of this too.
Right. It reminds me a little bit of Christmas time. I mean, it's almost like there's a bell curve, and it's like shifts over. So if you're in that tail end of the bell curve and you're having a hard time, you're more likely to talk to priests. I feel like people are talking to me more about, that just kind of like Christmas blues at that time. I can imagine the election's been a little bit like that for you too.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I mean, I have a small clinical practice. I'm primarily a college professor, but I do have a small clinical practice of 1 day a week. Every single one of my patients have come walking in talking about this. this. And these are patients, some patients who have remarkable stresses going on in their lives, plenty of distraction with other things, and yet they've got to drop everything and say, I got to talk about this.
Right. Well, that's what's so strange, because you're right. I mean, the 2008, it looked like the global financial system was going to melt down.
Right.
And it's amazing that this is more
Higher.
stressful than that.
Yeah, the surveys are saying this is more stressful for...
Why do you think that is?
For a variety of reasons. There's of course never a simple answer to any of these kind of questions, but but for a variety of reasons. I think this strikes to the core of who we are as people. This strikes to the core. Who are we? And when we talk about ethics and things like that, we always want to get back to that question. Who are we and who do we want to be? And so we are in a situation where a lot of those assumptions of who we are is being challenged in such significant ways. And that I think, I'd like to believe, and certainly as a person of faith and we're people of faith and so forth, we'd like to believe that that we want to strive towards the good.
Yeah.
We want to strive to make the world more humane, more just, more whole. And when someone can get elected who can brag about sexually violating women and be caught on tape, and somehow we're okay with that.
Right.
I think it just strikes to the core of who we are as human beings.
Yeah.
And the financial crisis, was certainly terribly discombobulating, of course, and people were really worried and upset. But it didn't strike to the core of who we are as human beings.
It's funny because our kids, we give them rules, and you're right, there's something very upsetting about when those rules are violated. And we've all been taught about how to, what's civil discourse and how to show respect for people in public. And I think you're right that's a huge part of this. Do you have talk to your students about just how to improve the quality of the discourse in the country?
Oh yeah, we sure do. Because, for example, at Santa Clara University, where I teach, we talk about the 3 C's. Now, you might think the 3 C's in Northern California would be, Cabernet, Chardonnay, cappuccino, but no, those are different 3 C's. No, these 3 C's are competence, conscience, and compassion. So competence, conscience, and compassion. And that's who we are, and that we tell our students. We try to encourage our students. That's who we are, that's who we hope you will be. And so when it comes to discourse and civility and things of that nature, that we say we always have to have our facts, and that's the competence part. We always have to be ethical. That's the conscious part. But we also have to be kind. And that's the compassion part. Right. And that's who we are. That is in our DNA. And that's how we have conversation. So when we have conversation with people who have very different points of view, we always treat them with respect and compassion. We can disagree. We can disagree vigorously.
Right.
But we always treat respect and compassion. And we believe that that's how we want to be, and that's who we should be.
Yeah. In your writing, you write about leaders of organization in this new reality, that they should be aware of 2 important social psychological theories. And the first is observational learning theory, and the second is social contagion theory.
Right.
I wonder if maybe you could explain those to us.
Sure.
It might be good for our vocabulary too, as we try to understand what's going on and try to help.
The observational learning theory, it's a social psychological theory that originally was popularized by a well-known psychologist at Stanford named Al Bandura. And it basically suggests that we model others. We look at other people, and we, particularly people who are being reinforced, who we think are good models, and we say, I want to behave like that. So this is why Hollywood celebrities and famous sports figures and leaders like President of the United States and so forth, we look at them, CEOs of companies and so forth, we look at them and say, that's a model for behavior. Just like children often will turn to parents and they'll pick up various kinds of mannerisms and so forth from parents. And we always say, parents often will say, do what I say, not what I do. But kids are going to do what you do, not what you say, as a rule. So we always look to these models. So observational learning is basically, we're always looking around and we're saying, how should we be in the world? And we look to models and say, that's how we should be in the world. And leaders, whether they like it or not or know it or not, they provide a model. Social contagion theory is a different social psychological theory, which basically says that you know how you can pick up a cold or a flu by hanging around somebody, shaking somebody's hand and then touching your nose or your eyes or something like that. Well, this is from a psychological point of view. You can pick up, you could say, viruses, if you will, good or bad, by hanging around other people. And so we tend to gravitate towards the norms of the group. And we do this in all sorts of subtle and not so subtle ways. So what happens is you pick up psychological, behavioral ways of being by catching it from other people. And these are really important because leaders, whether it's President of the United States or CEO of a company or president of a college or a pastor or a priest or whatever, they have influence that they may not always be attentive to. And if they're aware of observational learning and social contagion, they might be more thoughtful about how they do what they do if they want their community to be a certain way.
Right, and it's so much it's below the level of conscious thought. I mean,
that's right.
You may not even realize that what you think is cool is you think it's cool because this person you admire is an example of that.
Right.
Yeah, I just read Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind,
Right.
And one of his theses is that liberals have an idea of ethics as involving justice or fairness, but conservatives have like a broader range of categories. Like one of them includes purity. And I wonder if anything you notice in his thought is of relevance to what's going on right now, or what you have to say about his book.
Yeah, Jonathan Haidt is a psychologist, social psychologist at New York University, and have become a popular
the book is The Righteous Mind.
Right. And it's terrific. And his point of view, and he was our keynote speaker at the American Psychological Association's convention just this past summer in Denver. And from his point of view, which I think is really, really useful, is we too often get into our own little bubble of conversation. The left is over here and the right is over there, and if we're on Facebook or things like that, we kind of hang with our homies, you could say, on from the left or from the right. And we end up in these bubbles, or we watch MSNBC versus Fox News, and that this isn't such a good thing. And he talks also about the academy in academic life. The academic life, for the most part, leans left as a rule. Most faculty in universities across the land are more likely to be Democrat than Republican compared to national norms or national numbers. And so he also speaks about having a more enriched dialogue of bringing people together from different points of view and having conversation. And I love his thinking about this, and I say that at the core, it has to include civility, and again, competence, conscience, and compassion. That we can talk about anything as long as we're treated that way. And so there's been plenty of times, one of my areas of expertise has to do with sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, and we have had conferences where we've had bishops, victims, victim advocates, academics, all together,
right,
in conversation, with good food, with good wine, and it's so important to bring people together to get these different points of view, but at the core, if we hold on to competence, conscience, and compassion, we can talk about anything. We can do it respectfully and with kindness. And so I think Jonathan does a great job at saying we need to expand this conversation, bring people together, and not be just in our little bubbles talking to our people of like mind.
Yeah. A couple of months ago, I was reading a lot of articles about just like diagnosing the president.
Right.
And I wonder what your take on is on that is. What does it say about us as a people? What does it say about kind of our understanding mental health?
Right. This is a wonderful question. It's a big controversy. And in a nutshell, you can think of it in terms of the difference between what's called the Goldwater rule and the duck rule. And the Goldwater rule is basically back in the day when when Barry Goldwater was running, the American and people were starting to say, well, he's got psychiatric problems and this and that. And the American Psychiatric Association came up with a policy saying, look, you shouldn't be diagnosing people from afar.
Right.
You shouldn't do that. You haven't interviewed the person, you haven't done anything, you shouldn't do that. And so the American Psychiatric Association took that policy, and then the other organizations like American Psychological and others kind of went with that and said, no, we don't do that. Now that's different than the duck rule, which is if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck and it sounds like a duck, it's probably a duck.
Yeah.
And so you've got this kind of conflict.
Right.
And so a number of psychologists and psychiatrists have come forth and have said, look, we're in uncharted territory here. This is too important. And just last week, for example, the psychiatric community at Yale, you may have heard about this, had issued a statement saying this is a duty to warn. This is like a Tarasov situation. We have to warn the country because, we're in this unprecedented territory. And so this is a debate. But to me, it could be a red herring too, because in some respects, does it matter, does he meet the diagnostic criteria for a psychiatric disorder or not? Does it really matter? What matters is behavior.
Right.
And so what is the person who is the President of the United States actually doing and saying, regardless of what his DSM-3 diagnostic category might be? Now, the diagnosis can be helpful to be thoughtful of because it can help us predict behavior. If you know that somebody, for example, has an anxiety disorder, or let's say public speaking trouble, you know that if they're going to get into a situation with public speaking, they're going to probably be pretty anxious and they might want to take precautions. So diagnosis can certainly be helpful. Right. But in some respects, it can be a distraction from just real behavior and real what comes out of the mouth and what things get signed or whatever. Right. And that maybe we really need to focus and hone in there.
Right. This year, the Cathedral's theme, each year the Cathedral has a theme. This year the theme is the gift. And so we've been talking about, what happens outside of the market exchanges. What do we receive that it's not a result of having paid money for it. And I do think of it just like our ethical, kind of the philosophical heritage as being a kind of gift for us too. I mean, how's that been helpful in your life in terms of just helping people to thrive, those ideas, that you mentioned and do the right thing, that are, deontological ethics and consequentialist ethics and those kinds of things. How do they help people to thrive as human beings?
Yeah, I think it helps us to reflect on who we are and who we want to be and what we bring to the table. All of that is important. So if gift is your theme of the year, and you think of like gifts of the Spirit or something.
Exactly.
So people from Isaiah, Isaiah 11, gifts of the Spirit, of wisdom and, fear of God or awe,
right.
These kinds of things. And if we all ask ourselves, what are our gifts? It's sort of like if you're asked to attend a potluck dinner and you have to bring a dish, you want to say, well, what is my gift to this table?
Exactly.
And what's my go-to item to bring? Do I bring the green bean casserole? No. Do I bring the dessert? Do I bring the
pineapple ups and downs?
Right. The pineapple. And so in some respect, you're reflecting on your gift. And as we know, everyone has different gifts. From Corinthians, the body of Christ have many different parts.
Exactly.
And so not everyone can be an eye or a mouth or whatever. And so it's important to reflect on what do you bring, and everyone brings something to the table. What do you bring? And then how do you want to see your gift being used? And so when we talk about ethics and so forth, we say, look, we're making decisions every day about who we are as human beings. Don't we want to be intentional about it? Don't we want tools to be able to use our gifts in an intentional way? And so, for example, if you're going to bring a nice dessert to the potluck and it involves ice cream, always a good thing to have, you want to be thoughtful about how you're going to transport it to the event so it doesn't melt and so forth. And so when you understand your gift, now you have to say, how do I share that gift? And can't I be intentional? I'm going to put it in the car with the air conditioning on, or I'm going to pack it with ice to get it from point A to point B. So we have to kind of discover our gifts, and then use the ethical principles to help transport our gifts in ways that make the most sense and be intentional.
Yeah. I mentioned in our conversation earlier that my son is going away to college next year. And I do feel like there's basically 3 months for us to talk to him about. So what do you think are the most ethically challenging issues in college? How do parents talk about that before their children go?
Right, this is a great one. And I have a college student myself who's now a junior. And this is such a big question, because we read in the press and we worry about what goes on in college. There's a crisis, you could say, where we hear that the White House issued a report recently saying that about 20% of women have been sexually assaulted on a college campus. And you say, oh my goodness, what am I, maybe I should send my daughter to an all-girls school or something like that. And then you read about how about 500,000 students every year are significantly injured from alcohol-related events, with a good chunk, it's over 10,000, I can't remember the exact number, I think it's about 14,000, I can't remember the exact number, but a certain get seriously injured where they're hospitalized, and some die. And we heard just last week about this case at Penn State, a fraternity kind of hazing incident that resulted in the death of a student. We also hear about cheating scandals too. Harvard, it's some very prestigious schools, Harvard and Stanford and Dartmouth and so forth. A variety of schools have had cheating scandals. So it's scary to send your kid off to college. And I know, you had mentioned you're sending your daughter off to, your son off to Yale, 3,000 miles away. My son's at Dartmouth, 3,000 miles away. And you say, I can't spy on him. Luckily, Dartmouth has a really good webcam. Just saying, really good webcam. And so we have to have conversations about who are you and who are you going to be. And so my son, I always tell my son, we have this little thing where he was very involved with Boy Scouts, and he was an Eagle Scout, and I always say to him, remember, you're an Eagle Scout. Always act like an Eagle Scout. And so now when he tells me he's going to a frat party or he's going to whatever, all I have to do is text him an eagle emoji. Just a little emoji of the eagle. And he always texts me back and he says, always. And it's like, thank you. So it is scary because of the nature of the campuses now and what we hear about in the press. And so I think we want to have conversations about who are you, who do you want to be, and have some degree of conversation, not so much in terms of being authoritarian, saying, this is who you should be, this is what I expect of you, but just say, who do you want to be? My wife, Lori, is a psychologist and she has several writings, and in our book together, she talks about the 4 eyes of college-age kids. That developmentally they are going to be dealing with issues of independence, impulse control, intimacy, these kinds of issues. And if we're mindful of their developmental tasks, then we can realize that sometimes college kids do the wrong thing, but for the right reason.
Yeah, right, that's what I wrote down. I mean, you wrote, young adults are notorious for making the wrong decisions, often for the right reasons.
Right. And so, for example, let's say hazing and fraternities and drinking, they want to fit in. They want to be part of the club, you could say. But they kind of go over the top. Or maybe they get involved with sexual misbehavior. They want intimacy. They want love. They want intimacy. They want connection. But sometimes they don't negotiate that world very well. They want independence. They want to be separate from mom and dad, do their own thing, and live on their own terms. But sometimes they kind of go over the top. And sometimes it's helpful to remember that, in terms of brain development, that young people, their brain doesn't become fully developed until they're more mid to even late 20s. And so you're asking 18 to 22-year-olds to make these very important decisions about sex and alcohol and all that when their brains aren't quite even there yet. The judgment isn't quite there yet. And so what we need is to have the guardrails up.
Right.
And we want to have the guardrails up And there's a variety of ways that universities can do that, faith communities can do that, professors can do that to keep the guardrails up. So I tell my students, I teach an ethics course, for example, that I'm teaching now, psychology and ethics, and I always tell my students, I joke with them, and it comes to the end of the week, and they're going to have a weekend in front of them, and I always say, be ethical out there. Don't embarrass me. I don't want people to say, he took Professor Plante's class and he got, no, don't embarrass, do it for me, don't do it for you.
Yeah, I like the way that in the book you describe, a student wanting to be independent and so not going to the professor for help as being an example of, you have this desired goal, but the way that you're achieving it is.
Exactly.
It's my experience with young people in general is that, when they're going the wrong way, it's often, they've got some other story in their head for describing why they think they're doing the right thing.
Right. And that's a classic example, too, where so many parents will say, well, go talk to your professor. They have office hours for a reason. We're paying an amazing amount of money for you to go to college. There's services there, use them. But so often students say, no, I'm okay, I can do it on my own. And again, it's that effort for independence, but sometimes it's not thoughtfully considered.
Yeah. In Do the Right Thing, you talk about other ethical, so other ordinary life ethical issues. For most adults, what are those ethical issues that come up the most are, and what do we have to learn in terms of how we address those kinds of questions?
Yeah, and I think when we talk about ethics, we have to think it's not just the big things, like marital infidelity and cheating on taxes and embezzling money from your work. People often go to the big ticket items.
Yeah.
I say, no. It's everyday ethics. Ethics are everywhere. If you have the eyes to see, they're everywhere. Paper or plastic at the grocery store. Well, or bring your own bag. There's ethical questions every day. And so we say, well, look, we're making decisions every day anyways. Let's just be intentional. And so when we talk about ethics, we have to quote Socrates because, you just have to. And so when we talk about ethics, we talk about, Socrates had said, we're talking about no small matter, but how we ought to live.
Right.
And that's a really good way to think about ethics. No small matter how we ought to live. And there are a wide variety of tools. And this comes from 2,500 years or more of moral philosophy. And if we put all of those writings over all those years into a centrifuge and spin it around, you end up with a handful of principles. And they can be very helpful to consider just having as tools, like you have a hammer or a nail, a rule or a saw, that you can pull them out as desired. Things, different approaches, so utilitarian, justice, common good, absolute moral rules, virtue and values, and even egoism, which is interesting.
Right.
Because that's a big, egoism is you're trying to do nice things, good things, ethical things, but for selfish reasons. It's sort of like altruism in the service of narcissism. You try to do something good, but you want to feel good about yourself, or you want to see your name on the building, or whatever it is. And what's interesting is after teaching for about, at Stanford, and I've been teaching ethics and psychiatry at Stanford for about 30 years, and at Santa Clara in psychology for about 25 years, which is really amazing since I'm only 29 years old, is that in 30 years, I always ask people, okay, what kind of approaches have you been using to make these decisions? Inevitably, all the time, people will consider egoism.
Right.
They may or may not act on it, but they're considering it. And I say, don't be embarrassed by that.
Right.
Embrace that. It's
we're
okay.
social animals. We're going to be motivated by things like that.
That's right, and that's okay. We want to talk about it. It's okay. You can say, hey, look, it'll make me look really good if I do X. Okay, we'll go with that. If it ends up being a better world because you feel good about that, you want to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and that's why you're doing all this great stuff, well, good for you, great. But let's consider other points of view,
right,
too.
Exactly. That can't be the only thing.
Right. Let's consider all of them and then make an informed decision. And so I would say literally after teaching this stuff for 30 years, I feel like people always consider egoism. It's just that they may or may not choose to act on it.
Yeah. One of the things I thought was interesting in the Do the Right Thing book was just talking about the evolution and changes. That there's some basic principles that human beings are always going to be concerned about whether they're cheating on their spouses. But the changes in technology and changes and culture draw a different kind of us out. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about those changes in technology. I think they're hugely important in the last presidential election. But I mean, maybe you can talk about like selfies and like social media. Like what effect does that have on our kind of social life?
Right. This is terrific question, of course, because. And this also brings us to this place of uncharted territory, right? Because as you know, Facebook, everybody's on Facebook. I think everybody except my mother is on Facebook. And yet, Facebook is a new phenomenon, as you know. It's only been around since about 2006, and it really didn't kind of get steam until a little after that. And now everybody's on Facebook and social media. And not just Facebook, so many other elements of technology and social media platforms and so forth, things that young people know much more about than I do. And that has changed not only the way we interact with people, but it has changed our view of ourselves and of our others. And it has reinforced that kind of we're in this bubble thing. So we're getting our news, including what's called now fake news, through these mediums. You may know that Facebook has now developed a way to be able to scan, quote, fake news, and then you can still post it, but they ask you several times, are you sure you want to do this? And in some respects, they're asking you to consider yourself, are you going to be a person of honesty and integrity? Right. And so I think that social media has changed our world, and time will tell exactly how that is. We're still going through that. Now, you had mentioned selfies. Everything has a pro and a con, right? Everything has an advantage and a disadvantage. You think of selfies. Well, one of the nice things about selfies is that you don't have to bother some stranger in front of the Golden Gate Bridge to take your photo. You can do it yourself. Well, that's a good thing. But the bad thing is that it underscores this notion about it's all about me. It's all about me. And when it comes to Facebook, when it comes to selfies, it's very easy to get very narcissistic. Look at what I'm doing now. I'm having a cup of coffee at Grace Cathedral or something like this. Let's celebrate. And so it focuses more and more on me, 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 me. And the one thing that Americans could do less of is that.
Yeah, exactly. It may not be the best thing to exaggerate in this. So in the American Psychological Association, you are one of the people who deals with ethical questions there. Just like can you describe that work? And it seemed interesting to me when I learned a little bit about it.
Yeah, I'm in charge of the American Psychological Association's civility working group.
That's right.
Now you would think that a bunch of psychologists would not need a civility working group, but lo and behold, we do. And so we have, the American Psychological Association had gone through a really tough patch here. You may have heard, it was on the front page of the New York Times not that long ago, about some psychologists were involved with torture in Guantanamo Bay.
Of course.
During the Bush years and so forth. And this really created a real crisis in the organization, and things got really nasty and ugly. And the American Psychological Association has what you might call it's called the Council of Representatives, but it's like a Senate, and I'm on this Senate, and I go to my first meeting, which was the beginning of February, and it was not a pretty picture. And I was saying, whatever happened to competence, conscience, and compassion? I'm not seeing it here. Things got so ugly that they did find a need to have a civility working group. And so I chair this, and we're trying to bring civility back to the American Psychological Association, and I'm very hopeful about that. They've been terribly discombobulated by this story, as well as a few other things going on. But it speaks to the kind of how ironic is that a bunch of psychologists need help in this area. When we contacted some other organizations about, we want best practices, what are other organizations doing? Curiously, a number of organizations aren't doing much in this area, and we thought, well, geez, why is that? We could all use more civility.
Right. You know, you've done a lot of work with clergy sexual misconduct in the past, and I wonder how have churches and other institutions learned from that work? And then it sounds like it might be of use too in the work that you're doing with civility. I mean, how do you change institutions that have practices that can be so damaging and destructive to people?
Yeah, and as you know, the Catholic Church, which, you know, I'm a Catholic person, the Episcopalians, as you know, you're like our first cousins.
Our first cousins.
And the Catholic Church went through this terrible crisis around clergy abuse, which all started on January 6th of 2002 with the Boston Globe report. Of course, this has been an issue long before the Boston Globe. In fact, I've been working in this area since the 80s. We had a book that came out back in the 90s about this topic. In fact, we had a press conference on it. Nobody was interested. The only person we could get to show up from the press to our press conference was Don Lattin, who's a religion writer, you know, from locally, and he's the only guy who came and he wrote it up in the Chronicle, and nobody cared. And this was back in the late 90s, but when a crisis is also an opportunity, right? So the Catholic Church went through this big crisis. They had no choice. They pulled the highest-ranking woman in the FBI, a woman named Kathleen McChesney, pulled her from the FBI and had her run this branch of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops to kind of clean this up. They brought in some heavy-hitting Catholic lay people, Leon Panetta, for example, who's a Santa Clara grad, just saying, and Frank Keating, who was at the time, I believe, the Oklahoma governor, and brought some heavy-hitting Catholics to kind of clean this up. And they came up with what's called the Dallas Charter, which was in June of 2002, where the bishops met in Dallas and came up with this document about this is how we should handle this. So then they put together a National Review Board, a group of lay people who would look at policies and procedures about how to keep kids safe. And for about 4 years, I was on that board. And came up with great policies and procedures, best practices. We also had conferences with other groups that focus on children, Boy Scouts, U.S. Olympic Committee.
What are examples of those best practices? I know what they are in Boy Scouts, but for the church, like what's an example of some of those? Yeah,
so there's a bunch of best practices that we developed and compared notes with, and other groups are using.
Like in Boy Scouts, it's
two deep rule.
Exactly.
Two deep rule is brilliant.
Yeah.
So the two deep rule is, which is from Boy Scouts, is that an adult cannot be alone with a child unless that child is their own child, right? So I can be alone with my son, but I can't be alone with other scouts, and that's taken very seriously. So I can remember, bringing my son to somebody's house to work on a merit badge, and we happened to be the first ones there. And so before my son's allowed to walk into that house, another scout has to be present. Right. So a child can't walk into that house without another scout with him. So it's brilliant. And so we say, well, one of those policies is that if you're with young people, you always make sure there's a second person, a second adult, ideally, there, so that you don't have a one-on-one situation.
Right.
So that's one best practice. Second is any accusation is taken seriously. So if there's any kind of accusation, you kick in a way to evaluate that, to make sure that if law enforcement needs to be informed, you do that, and you pull the person from ministry. If somebody has any credible accusation of offending, you're pulled from ministry, never to go back again. So I have a patient in my private practice who is what we call a chartered priest, or a priest who was found to have credible accusations and so forth. I've been seeing him for 20 years now, and he cannot be alone. I mean, when he comes to see me, he has to have someone come with him. Right. He can't go to the grocery store or to anywhere unaccompanied. And so there are some the Dallas Charter, I think, is a terrific instrument. Other church groups are starting to use elements of that. that helps keep kids safe, but you needed the crisis to get there.
Right.
And maybe that's true for where we are today. Maybe we've had a crisis in terms of this post-election stress disorder that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Maybe we've got a crisis that can get us there. And where is there?
For me, I mean, the crisis, I mean, I recognize how much power is held in the executive office. So
Right.
maybe having the president be the one to make the sole decision about nuclear attack is
Right.
not a good idea. Maybe, some of the other, bombing overseas. So you're right. I mean, there may be an opportunity here, but we just have to pay attention to it.
Right.
One of our traditions at Grace Cathedral is we take questions. So if you'll have a little note card, and don't hesitate to write out your question, and Rebecca Nessel will collect your questions and bring them up to us. And I read the questions. So
Great.
So really good handwriting is a big plus. I think one of the, for me pastorally, when people come to me for pastoral issues, one of the biggest issues that they come to me for is forgiveness.
Yes.
Issues of having to do with forgiveness. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that. I mean, I think almost everyone I can think of has some kind of struggle about having to do with forgiveness.
Right. Yeah. And there's a huge literature on forgiveness from a psychological point, an empirical standpoint that looks at the health benefits of forgiveness.
Oh, great.
Both the psychological and the physical health benefits of forgiveness. What we know clearly from the literature is that the element of forgiveness that's so key is to hold toxic anger is a bad thing. If you hold anger, and usually when you're upset with somebody, and there's plenty of reasons to be upset with people, whether it's loved ones or co-workers, the boss, or even the person who cut you off on the freeway,
right.
You hold anger. This has implications for cardiovascular health and so forth. So for example, when we look about the coronary prone behavior pattern, or the type A behavior pattern that leads to coronary heart disease, we see that the most important element of that leads to cardiovascular disease in terms of that style is hostility and anger. So we speak of anger as being a toxic substance, and bitterness a toxic substance, and there's plenty of research that supports that. So we say forgiveness becomes very, very important, not just because it's the right thing to do or because we're asked to forgive, like in the gospel. How often should I forgive my neighbor?
Right.
7 times no, 7 times 7, So that it's not just about it's the right thing to do, but it's also the right thing to do for us, whether the person deserves forgiveness, asks forgiveness, or whatever, or if they accept it, that we need to do it for us. The other thing is it important to remember that forgiveness is not it's not a black and white.
Right.
It's a
not
continuum.
on and off switch.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the forgiveness thing, it's really a continuum. Let's say it's a 10-point scale, where 10 points is like complete forgiveness, which is not forgetting, by the way. It's forgiveness, not forgetting. 10 is completely forgiveness, and 1 is holding on to that bitterness and rage and so forth. Is that you might be at a 4. Well, if you can get to a 5, that's a step in the right direction. You may never get to 10,
Right.
but you can get to 5, maybe 6. And that this is important not only because people of faith believe that it's the right thing to do, but maybe selfishly, based on egoism, it's the right thing for you, because to hold on to that anger is just going to tear you apart. So you got to let it go, work at it, try to get that 4 to a 5 or a 5 to a 6. Just move the ball a little further down the field, so that you can be more at peace.
Yeah, because it's easy just to despair and just say, I'll never be able to do this. But you're right, if you can make an incremental change, that may make a huge difference in your life.
Right.
Another thing that you've written a lot about is just violence in our society.
Right.
And I wonder what you have to say about that.
Well, remember earlier when we were talking about observational learning and social contagion, we were talking about how we model after others.
Right.
And we kind of pick up the behaviors of others around us. And so the challenge here is that we live in a world and culture, as you know, where sex and violence are just everywhere.
Yeah, like video games and
the video
television.
games, sports, and so forth, very violent and very often very sexual. And what we know from observational learning and social contagion is that if you observe others engaging in violent acts, you're more likely to participate in violent acts. And now there's a whole literature on this about the influence of media and violence, and it's a complicated literature. In fact, the American Psychological Association has just issued a kind of a white paper on this that is soon to be published in the American Psychologist, our flagship journal. And so, there's a lot of good research in this area. But the bottom line is that if we want to live in a community of peace and of love, and again, back to 3 C's, competence, conscience, compassion, then we need to be able to see it and experience it everywhere. So for example, during the Olympics, and I thought this was a really good idea. People love the Olympics. Part of the reason is you see some sports you don't normally see, and you see the camaraderie among athletes. And we had this one moment in the Olympics that we were very excited about, which was a gal, Abby D'Agostino, who was on the track team at Dartmouth, where my son is on the track team. And she had this moment where she collided with some other runners in, I think it was the 5,000 meter, and her and a New Zealand athlete fell down. And Abby picked her up and said, stopped, picked her up and said, we got to do this. We got to finish this together. And so she picked up the New Zealand runner. They ran.
Wow.
And then Abby fell down, and the New Zealand runner picked her up and said, we're doing this together. It's a beautiful moment.
Yeah.
And people love this moment.
Right.
And in fact, this commencement at Dartmouth this year, they're giving Abby an honorary degree.
Wow.
That when the Olympians went to the White House with President Obama, he specifically pointed Abby out and gave her a shout out. Not that she won any, and she wasn't going to win anyways. I mean, she was not favored in any way to win. But it was a great example of that's who we want to be.
Yeah. That's
modeling. That's the social contagion we want. That's the way we want to be.
Right. So can video games be like that? Or
that's what we're
like
aiming
that?
for.
Exactly.
Right, exactly, rather than what we see. So I joke with my wife, my wife likes, she's from this area, and she likes the San Francisco 49ers, and she likes, football and things like that. And I joke with her, I say, football's kind of a violent sport. But she says, the athletes, they're beautiful, what they can do with their bodies, and I appreciate that. But I said, wouldn't it be better if they turned it into flag football? And she's like, no, that's not. I said, yeah, but that would be kind of safer, and it'd be less violent. And she says, you're going too far, Tom.
I've got some great questions here. So the first is, I have friends who want to rant about Trump all the time. This is depressing. How can I let them know without putting them down?
Yes, this is a wonderful question, isn't it? Because I know some people want to do that. Now, and we've had dinner parties, and we had a dinner party last night. We had one a few months ago where we said, okay, guys, we're not going to talk about politics. Okay, we've got to have, about 8 people.
Take a break.
We're going to take a break. We're not going to talk about. We're going to, give it 20 minutes. Bang, boom. It's like, oh. And so, there's only so much we can take, right, in all this. Just like, for example, if you're watching the news or like CNN or something like that, you feel like, oh my God, there's only so much you can take. And it's understandable. And we all need a break. And plenty of people say, and I experience this sometimes myself, I used to always listen to NPR as I'm driving down to work, and KQED and so forth, and sometimes you just go say, I just got to listen to some music, and because it's too much. So we all have our breaking point. And so I think somehow we have to kind of thoughtfully, with compassion, give people corrective feedback and say, I know you're upset about this, but I need a little bit of a break today. I only can handle so much. Let's pick it up tomorrow or another day. But I think we have to be gentle with each other. We have to be kind to each other. And we want people to be able to, talk about what troubles them, but to do that in a way that can acknowledge that, sometimes we all just need a break.
Yeah, I love that. The biggest ethical issues for me always occur at work. At what point does one give up on a job or career? Yeah,
that's a terrific question, and I do get that all the time, not only with my clinical patients, but I give workshops for mental health professionals to, renew their CE credits, for their license as their psychologists or social workers or so forth. And people will say this, I'm working in a job that it's not an ethical place. It's sort of a place that I feel like I come home and I have to take a shower, just to kind of clean myself off. And I say, sometimes people don't have much of a choice, right? I mean, they it's a job, and it pays them well, and it pays them well enough, and they're afraid to move to another place. But then we can say, okay, if you can't make a change, is there a way that you can always remind yourself of who you are and who you want to be in the world, and regardless of what's going on around you, can you be sort of a light? So for example, you all have heard those sayings about, like, it just takes a one candle to light a room.
Right.
And you say, can you get support elsewhere from church or civic organizations or other places, friends, family, so that you can be a light in the darkness?
Yeah.
And if you can do that, hopefully, because of what we know about observational learning and social contagion theory and other theories, can that light spread?
Right.
And sometimes people can help to transform their workplace based on who they are, and if you can make a change, well, that's on the table as an option. But we can always be a light in the darkness, no matter where we are.
Yeah, and by the same token, I think your body does speak to you. I mean, you can know that your workplace is demanding things of you ethically that are just not acceptable. Here's another question: how can I let go of my snobbish and angry attitude towards people, not the poor, but people who voted for Donald Trump?
Yeah, that's a great, wonderful question. Yeah, and I think the way I think of it all the time is, if I go back to Romans 3, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, including me. The very first interview with Pope Francis when he became Pope, the first question was, describe yourself. Who are this kind of thing. First thing out of his mouth was, I'm a sinner. And I think that's powerful to say, yeah, we can be snobby, we can be kind of high and mighty about our points of view, or we can be like we want to throttle people who have a different point of view. And I think if I say it almost like a mantra, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and that including me. And to see kind of the humanness in everybody, the divine spark in everybody. In our Christian tradition, we say, Jesus is in there somewhere. I mean, it's not always easy to see, but you got to invite him out. That even those who we find most offensive, I'd like to think that there's that divine spark in there, and that but obstacles have come in front of them.
Right.
And then I think people do want to be good. People do want to be ethical, but they've got challenges that sometimes make that hard.
Yeah, definitely. Here's a question about guilt. Can you share an ethical and psychological perspective about guilt?
Guilt. I'm Catholic. I do guilt in spades. When my wife and I were trying to decide to get married, my wife happens to be Jewish, and we were having this conversation. Can a Jew and a Catholic get married? And we're like, well, we both have the guilt. We're just guilt about different things. And again, sure. I mean, we do experience, guilt. I could have done this. I should have done that, and so forth. And that can be really terribly handicapping, And I think at some points, people of faith, here we are at Grace Cathedral, there's always forgiveness. There's always reconciliation. There's always, dust yourself off and we'll try again. And again, we're all sinners.
Right. Yeah, and God loves us just in the way that we love our children. I wouldn't want my child to go through debilitated by guilt, and I know God doesn't want me to be the same.
Yeah.
Recently, there have been several violent confrontations on college campuses between students and outsiders with different political viewpoints. Right. Do you have any suggestions as to how we can improve tolerance on both sides and move toward civil conversations on difficult issues? Yeah,
that's a great question too. And of course, this whole situation at UC Berkeley is really horrific. And of course, there's folks who are looking for a fight. I mean, they may have nothing to do with UC Berkeley, but they know that that's kind of ground zero for fighting and looting and making a mess of things. And Janet Napolitano, another Santa Clara grad, just saying, I know has got her hands full trying to figure out what to do here, particularly given that Berkeley happens to be situated in an environment that's so urban and where people can very easily kind of get into that campus and that environment. And so I think it's really, really important. And again, UC Berkeley is, as you know, is a state secular school. It's not a religious affiliated school like Santa Clara, for example, where we so strongly believe in these 3 C's and that what we're all about. Berkeley has a harder time to do that. But still, even if you are at a secular school, or I jokingly say to my son, at Dartmouth, which is a secular school, it's a secular godless school. Is God at Dartmouth? I don't know. And even if you're at a secular godless school, there are certain virtues and values that you hold near and dear. And so in an academic environment, at a place like Berkeley, it's free speech matters,
right.
But free speech isn't hate speech. That we engage in free speech with civility, with dialogue, with compassion, and that we have to do everything, and everybody has a role to play. Whether it be the university administrators, faculty, staff, the community, the police, law enforcement in general, everybody has a role to play. And they all have gifts to bring to the table, but we do it in a certain way.
Right. Regarding forgiveness, many find that once one's life gets to a better place, they are where they want to be. It's easier. I'm more likely find forgiveness can occur on my 1 to 10 scale. Do you have thoughts on this correlation, just of like moving on and having things better, or is this just happenstance or true for this person's experience?
I'm not really sure I fully understand that question.
Me neither, but I'm doing my best. I think what she's trying to say is getting that sometimes there's like some time that passes,
right.
and you move on to a better situation, right. And that may make it easier to forgive than when you're...
Yeah, I think that is true. I mean, there is something to be said about time heals, and we do know that, for example, 2/3 of all depressions will lift after about 6 months with or without treatment. So even depression, which is so common, more often than not, people will feel better over time if they just give it a time. It's one of the reasons why we say when it comes to suicide, we often will say that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem.
Right.
And we say for a lot of folks that are in the middle of pain, terrible pain, but this too shall pass. There is hope out there. And sometimes that's hard for people to hear. And so certainly over time, things often will get better. Just statistically, they'll probably get better. And that it's a process, so for forgiveness, sometimes one is never ever going to get to the 10, but they're going to get a little bit better. I have a patient in my practice that I've seen for many, many years. She's a woman in her 70s, and she still struggles with, having a hard time forgiving her mother, who died probably 30 years ago. She still struggles with that. It's been 30 years since she died, and it's still struggles. But she, 3 steps forward, a step back. 3 steps forward, 2 steps back.
Yeah.
And you just try to work that to move in the right direction, even though you might never get to where you want to be. And there's hope there.
Yeah. What does the white paper say about causes of violence?
Yeah, this American Psychiatry, what they did is looked at all the research, particularly looking at media-related violence, because the question that is in the minds of so many parents is, should I let my kid play video games?
Oh, yeah.
Should I let my kid be on the computer and look at these things? And is that going to make my child violent? And so they looked at all the research in that area, and they basically say that, for vulnerable people, media can kind of tip them towards a violent direction. That media doesn't necessarily cause people to become violent. So in other words, if you watch something aggressive in a video game and you have none of the other risk factors, you are abused, you're neglected, you've got troubles in school or troubles in home or whatever, you're not going to just kind of finish watching your video game and go out there and do violence. But that for vulnerable people, it can add to predicting violence. And so it basically speaks, and I'd encourage you to just get on the APA website, www.apa.org, and just search media violence if you're interested in this, because they've got a lot of resources on here, and maybe watch for this paper that's coming out. But if you want to unpack it. But it seems to play a role, but it doesn't seem to play a role in the way that maybe the average person thinks that it does. Just looking at stuff doesn't lead to people running out there and doing violence on the street, which is some good news.
Great. Well, we're just running out of time, but I wanted to ask before we're done, just what signs of hope you see in the future. I mean, you've got such a wonderful, optimistic outlook on things, and you've done so much work on some of the most intractable and difficult problems that we have as a society. So what signs of goodness are you seeing?
I think, I know we can all get kind of depressed at times and down at times, including me, and I can say, oh my God, we're going to hell in a handbasket here. This is just not good. And, I say, well, geez, maybe Santa Clara University can have a satellite branch like somewhere else, like in Canada or New Zealand or something. I don't know. And so it's easy to get discouraged. But, I think that at the end of the day, people do want to be good.
Yeah.
They want to be ethical. They want the world to be better, and they do care about each other. And I think there's a variety of biological, psychological, social, evolutionary, spiritual, religious factors that kind of lead us in that direction. That sometimes we have to just take a deep breath, and we have to get ourselves organized and centered. And we have to say, okay, who do I want to be? Who do I want to become? And, miracles have happened in the past. Things have changed on a dime in the past. Let's bring our gifts to the table, whatever those gifts are, and try to encourage that light in everybody to come on out, and let's go make this world better, no matter what's going on in Washington.
Yeah, I love that your image of your whole life as bringing gifts to a potluck dinner, and making sure that A, that you have those gifts, and B, that you know how to transport them. Well, I'm so grateful for our conversation today. Next week, we're going to be talking to Kristen Enos. She's going to be telling the story of being an Asian American lesbian feminist in Orange County. And her comic book is up for winning an award, a Lambda Award, and she wrote it with the help of my wife, Heidi, who's a law professor at USF. So she'll be our guest next week to talk about those issues. Please join us upstairs for the 11 o'clock liturgy. Grace Cathedral is a house of prayer for all peoples. We also rely on your gifts, too, to make the forum possible. So if you get a chance, please leave a gift out there in the box with Rebecca. And finally, thank you very much for joining us, Thomas Plante. We're so blessed that you could be part of this conversation. We all learned things that I'm sure we'll take away for this next week.
Well, thank you to you, Malcolm, and thank you to all of you. I'm very grateful for all of you. Thank you. Thank you.